All right, I feel like we've given enough time and we can kind of get rolling here. So welcome everyone to this Placer AI webinar, Physical Retail, the CPG Perspective. I will give you a quick look at what we're going to be doing today. We're going to start off with a very brief introduction to Placer for those of you who are new. We're going to look at some of the things we've been seeing from the latest data, so that most recent of trends. And then we are going to dive deep into this CPG perspective. And as always, we are going to leave time for Q&A. If at any point within the conversation you have a question, please plug that question into the Q&A box. It is situated either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on how you have Zoom configured. And we will make sure to get to as many as possible within the course of the conversation or at the end. And I am really thrilled to be joined today by, I think this is our first time doing like the tag team from one company, and it is a pretty amazing tag team indeed, to be joined by Heather Adams, Shopper Insights Manager at Reckitt, and Holly Smothers, Category Team Lead from Reckitt. Heather and Holly, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
And the name alliteration was an absolute demand, so everyone should know that was a key piece of this. But we've had a lot of conversations internally. We're really thrilled that they were willing to join and talk through, because I think so much of the time we think about physical retail from in the lens of the retailers, the shopping centers. We don't enough go into what is that impact on the product perspective, and that those products are ultimately what's bringing us into retail. But that quick introduction. So what is Placer? How do we get our data? So we observe a panel of over 30 million devices throughout the United States. Very critically, this is all we get. The data we get back is all anonymized aggregate data. So we are GDPR and CCPA compliant. We then utilize machine learning and AI algorithms to analyze that data and make estimations on visit trends throughout the United States to retail locations. And we present that data in a wealth of different reports within our platform on everything from the customer journey, visit counts, true trade areas, cross-shopping, and a whole lot more. If anyone is interested, we have a section on our website called The Square, placer.ai-the Square, where you can access some of our free tools. You can also utilize our free version of our premium product at placer.ai. And if anyone is interested in location data, please check that out. But now into kind of the thick of things and why we're all here today. So let's start with the latest data and kind of looking over kind of this retail recovery in general. And Heather, I'll start with you here. When you look at how retail recovered in 2021, how does it impact the way you view brick and mortar's retail future?
Good question. So the first thing I would say is that I think regardless of the volatility in brick and mortar is a space that's going to stay. Even during the height of the pandemic, where we had a lot of people who were afraid to go into physical retail stores, there was a lot of desire and demand to go back to physically shopping in stores as soon as they felt it was safe to do so. There's this psychological need to be able to see something in a store and be able to take it home with you immediately. So as much as we're going to start to see online shopping becoming bigger and bigger, it's strictly a complement and not a replacement of brick and mortar. So two things that the digital shopping experience have not been able to replace that brick and mortar does really well is, one, giving you that ability to touch and feel the products. And this is especially important in those high risk categories. Think big ticket items or maybe some sensitive categories where you want to be able to physically interact with the product. The other is that instant gratification that I was sort of starting to touch on. Even though you can order online and get something in as little as an hour, there's this thrill you get when you walk into a store, you discover something for the first time and you're able to stick it in your pocket and leave with it, or stick it in your shopping cart more accurately. So I think brick and mortar is definitely here to stay, despite what we've seen during the pandemic.
I agree with you. And I touch on that discovery point, I think is one of the things we don't discuss enough, because it is part of the excitement of going to stores. What else might I find? We talk about this treasure hunt and off price, but it kind of exists in everything we do. I mean, and I couldn't agree more. I think it's such an important piece of the puzzle. Holly, coming to you on this one, we are not far removed from kind of the dominant narrative in the retail space being this retail apocalypse perspective. Yet we've seen this kind of impressive turnaround, even in what should have been the perfect storm against brick and mortar retail. Do you think we've kind of finally left that retail apocalypse language in the past?
Retail apocalypse is such a fun term to me too. You used to see it associated with shopping malls and the ways that stores would kind of vacate from there, and these dead zones, basically, where shopping malls used to be. But I think you'll continue to see the term retail apocalypse used when describing the demise of department stores and those retailers that tend to think of physical and digital in very rigid terms instead of complementary to each other. Some of these retailers may think of them competitively. So e-commerce is essentially at a pivotal defining moment right now. And the retailers that seize it and adapt to stay alive are going to be the ones that are most successful. You have to think about what drivers enable omni success. It's being nimble, being agile, being able to respond to meet the changing needs of the shopper in the moment. And in my opinion, when you look back at the long list of stores that have shuttered or faced, significant closures over the years, I think of, Circuit City and Service Merchandise and Kmart and Sears and all these stores that may have lacked the agility or the ability to move with that speed and flex their model to respond in the face of change and rapid market innovation, competition. It's all about how fast you can pivot and your ability to listen to the shopper and then implement quickly. The shopper expects retailers and these department stores to master the basics: the app, the website, delivery, and delivery includes, online pickup, ship to store, curbside, the convenience aspects of delivery. So, thinking about maybe the term of the future here, you might coin it as like retail renaissance, or that may be the more fitting description for what's happening around us now as retailers have been forced to reinvent shopper experience and personalize, engage in new ways with shoppers. And, it was do or die during the pandemic, and the retailers that seamlessly satisfy digital and physical shopper needs and embed data excellence into their model, those will be the retailers that win the marketplace along the way.
It's so interesting because we talk about this a lot of I think you phrased it really well, of like a rigid distinction between these different elements, as opposed to recognizing that it's one shopper and it's these variety of channels for reaching them, and understanding how to pull those levers properly. I do think that's one of the biggest challenges, that those who are struggling, it's because of a rigidity in thinking and not
Right.
that lack of flexibility. And so, some of the retailers that have shown quite a great degree of flexibility are those that have been kind of those who have started the year well, even in this incredibly difficult retail environment. And Heather, I'll kick off with you here. How significant do you think kind of this mass number of challenges that brick and mortar retailers face have been, from supply chain, labor shortages, COVID, now inflation? And how do you kind of contextualize performance in this environment? Because it's not a normal situation.
You're absolutely right. It's not normal at all. I think when we look back on the last 2 years, it's been every challenge in the book been for us, not just as retailers and manufacturers, but as humans as well. So one thing we've seen is not just an evolution of changes, but an acceleration of them. So take, for instance, the shoppers that pre-pandemic would vote with their dollars, and they would spend more on the brands and retailers that aligned with their values. Now we're seeing that explode into where they're choosing to work. We're seeing more strike activity. We're seeing people walking off the jobs and retiring early. So it's really just this acceleration of what was bubbling, beneath the surface before, but at such a larger scale and at such a faster pace. And in order to in this sort of environment, you need to track your performance a little bit differently. So those comps versus year ago are always going to be part of the mix, but you need to reframe your process a bit and think about it more in these more smaller and more frequent intervals. So as change occurs in the market, you need to be able to adapt your forecasts on a much more immediate basis. Volatility, I would say, is no longer an if, but something that needs to be built into your planning.
That's so interesting. Holly, I'll go to you with this. When you kind of think about performance within this environment and the volatility that Heather was mentioning, how do you balance the desire to kind of adapt to what's needed in the moment with the kind of concern of overreacting to something that's really short term?
I tend to think about this in terms of kind of managing through some of the, complexities that we have. So I use guideposts in this. And the first guidepost I have is, be acutely aware of the risk involved. And that can be, cost of entry. It can be the marketing. It can be, there's costs, there's systems, there's capabilities that you need to expand into. It can be expertise that you have to acquire. So just be acutely aware of how much is at stake and the cost associated with that. When you identify those costs, that allows you to evaluate the situation a little more surgically and then know what your opportunity looks like. Just be very eagle-eyed about it. And then the second thing I think about is that, high quality data has to underpin every move. So, as I mentioned earlier, responding with agility and being nimble, being flexible, that allows you to remain competitive in the marketplace and keep pace with your peers. But you also need to act with precision so you can take advantage of your existing assets, your store, your scale, et cetera. So data algorithms a lot of times hedge the gap and allow us to do both in minutes. So the faster you're able to generate data insights, the closer you can get to a decision that yields value for you.
It's a great answer. And it kind of speaks to this, yes, there is, just because the situation around you is crazy, doesn't mean that it's like, okay, well, you throw everything out. You kind of still have to have this process this way of approaching things to make a decision that you're going to feel good about, both in the short and long term. But to me, that's been one of the most fascinating elements of like, how do you, with everything shifting so constantly, how do you find this balance between, we think this is something really short term and therefore we want to try and satisfy as we can, but we're not going to overdo it because we think it's going to bounce back. And that kind of leads me into this. And, Holly, I'll stay with you here. Like it does feel like, there's just this constant state of flux. And so, kind of almost a continuation of what you were saying before, like, do you see, like, apart from these guideposts, do you see like a fundamental shift in like your strategy and your overall approach? Or is it, look, we just try to deal with things as they come?
My data answer, I think, is what is the key here. You stay data driven, you stay focused on the information that you have. And then, a lot of times we have competing sources of data in this data rich world. So finding a way to layer those and connect the dots between them, I think that's very important when you're looking for insights in your incoming information. Things come in so quickly that you have to be, focused on, what's the latest, not what did I know was true 6 months ago, or what did I know was true 3 months ago. That can change in the drop of a dime. The other thing too is staying focused on the forces that are hitting every shopper segment. We know that shopper behavior has changed. We know that shopper attitudes have changed. The climate is very volatile, as Heather mentioned. So thinking about, new government regulations, programs can have an impact on struggling shopper segments. You think about the number of people that have migrated in the past 12 to 24 months. It's a massive number of people that are leaving big cities, headed to more suburban and rural areas. So it affects the when, the where, and the what of their shopping mission now. And those behavior changes and the attitudinal changes are going to be the most important to track and measure over time. Inflation as well. With the inflationary period we're in now, gas prices have risen. So, we're seeing people cutting back potentially on driving cars, and it leads to a lot of questioning, a lot of rethinking what we know, and then digging deeper to ensure that we have, the right frame of mind as each of these shopper shifts, behavioral shifts, attitudinal shifts happen, and digging further to see their impact.
Yeah, it kind of changes that whole decision tree of like, am I going to go out now? Where am I going to go if I do decide to go out? What's the main product I need? What's this? It's just a different. I like the when, the questions of like of how that perspective shifts. But Heather, to go to you on this one, we think about it from that product perspective. I mean, what do you think the keys are to succeeding in an environment that's kind of defined by this level of volatility, this amount of change?
Absolutely. So the first thing I would say from my insights perspective is really look at the less obvious ways to connect with your customer. So whether it's for a product or for a great retail experience, don't stop at the surface level, continue to dig. And I'll give you a specific example. So when you think about product performance, it's often representative of what is the role of that product in the person's life. The more meaningful that role is, the more likely that customer is going to stick with you if things get a little rough. If you need to take price or if something in your product needs to change, your most loyal customers are the ones that are going to stick with you. So if we think about the recent pandemic trend of more meals at home, at the surface level, the first thing you think about when you think more meals at home is more groceries purchased, more dishes being washed, the kitchen being cleaned more often. But if you really want to connect with that shopper and create a meaningful relationship, you think about the larger human insight of more meals at home could mean more family time, more connecting with other people that are meaningful to you. And your brand, your retail experience could play a role in that connection. So really, it's about digging deeper, thinking about what's beyond just that surface level and getting to the heart of what matters to your customers.
I mean, that it's such a, it's so interesting how you kind of phrase it, because there are these, very often I feel we're like, all right, well, there's more, we were doing a webinar about grocery yesterday, and we were talking about like, okay, so there's more cooking at home. Is that sustainable? You're right. There's more cooking at home. There's more dishes to do. If there's more dishes to do, it's this kind of endless series of if this, then that, and causes. And if you don't understand that full context of that kind of waterfall of decisions, you're missing out on opportunities to really, I guess, be there for your customer in a way that you might not have been able to be there in the past as these things kind of shift. It's fascinating. I think one of the areas that has been, really interesting for us to look at is to try and understand what elements are part of something kind of long term and what things are kind of less. So these kind of longer term shifts. And so, Holly, I'll start with you here. Like, some retailers are like, think about something as simple as like, pets, right? If there's more visits to pet stores because we got pets, that's not something that's going to trail off, because if your cat needed to eat 6 months ago, it probably needs to eat in a year from now. That's not going to change. And so, some of these retailers are seeing signs these trends might be longer lasting. I mean, how does it kind of change the way you view these chains as they go through these major shifts?
These chains become a little bit more disruptive, I think, than we originally considered them. So in my mind, home improvement was a standout performer in the pandemic in terms of foot traffic. We saw, you think about lockdown and then those areas during the pandemic where people were investing in their homes and outdoor space. People were making a large number of trips to their home improvement stores to either invest in garden space, invest in patio space. People were spending time outside and also getting into new hobbies. So one of the things that you start to see during the pandemic is Home Depot and Lowe's embracing these areas of the store where they previously weren't fully invested. So you walk into a hardware store now and you see a lot of surface care products and laundry care products and things that previously may not have been as big a part of their strategy. So pet is also a great example. And we know, through the pandemic that there were, a lot of homes that added pets to their household. You saw, in the news, people, embracing fosters and rescues and adoptions, that kind of thing. So so many houses now with pets at home, and that's a space too. When I go to stores and I look around, I see retailers starting to invest, or home improvement stores specifically starting to invest in pet spaces. So given the way that we spend time at home too, and the way that our home has become like a makeshift gym or home office, that kind of thing, it also causes us to reinvent a little of what our home has become. So you may be seeing home improvement stores or other stores embrace that aspect of living in the future, and I think that's part of going back to my point about staying data driven and anticipating, what's coming potentially, staying close to trends, staying close to shopper attitudes, behaviors, routines, and patterns, that all kind of underpins your strategy when you look at where do I want to go? How do I want to engage with that, shopper potentially, or re-engage with them?
I mean, look, Lowe's now has, like, I think it was PetSmart or Petco, I forget which one, within their stores, but Heather, it goes back to your point of, like, how does this decision tree change of, like, if I go into a home improvement store and I'm thinking within, all right, well, what's the project I want to do? And we're going into the pets, and, like, okay, all of a sudden it kind of makes sense that this space that we wouldn't have seen certain types of items, now we start to see it. But I mean, it's fascinating to me how kind of expansive it is. And I mean, where these kind of impacts have been and who's taken advantage of them. And that's been really, it's just, again, I guess, there's times where you put two and two together, and there's times where you're like, does that two and that two go together? And it works, and you just didn't realize it before, which is fascinating. I mean, Heather, I'll go back to you on this one. I think one of the other elements here has been kind of, what does loyalty mean, and how do we kind of generate that loyalty, and how significant is that? Do you think shifts like an increasing focus on loyalty and driving that, do they change the way you interact or think of retailers or specific retailers?
Well, of course, every retailer wants to be the preferred destination. So one of the things that we think about when we're thinking about shoppers shifting their loyalty is digging into that deeper why. What's really driving it? And is it something that feels like a flash in the pan trend, or something that's going to really stick around? So you can even learn a lot from declining retailers as people are walking away from a store. What's driving that? What's the motivation there? And one of the tools is, of course, looking at foot traffic. That can be a barometer for change. It gives you that early indication when people are starting to walk, maybe even before you flagged it in your data that there's a problem, you're starting to see something happening. So keep an eye out for those early indicators, dig into the whys, and then also look at some of the drivers that you may not have thought about a few years back. So Holly touched on the social media influencers. And one of the things that we've seen is there will be a trend that pops up on TikTok about new ways to clean your bathroom. And we'll suddenly see people adopting products that we otherwise wouldn't have considered to be a traditional product for that use. So, keep your eyes out and look in the places that your shoppers are looking.
Does it speak to my age and lack of coolness that I'm like, oh, I would be on TikTok if they had like videos on how to clean my bathroom better? When that's the draw to a social media, that's when you're in trouble. I think, and we've touched on this quite a bit, but this idea of like having this kind of wider retail perspective to me is really fascinating. And I think maybe the biggest takeaway we've discussed so far is that you can't be, oh, hey, we're a company that normally sells through grocery, therefore we can only focus on grocery. You really have to have this more expansive view of things. And I'm going to go to both of you with the same question here, but I mean, what do you think the lessons are, or how would you approach learning these lessons from the wider retail ecosystem? And then what's the approach to then going and applying this information? And Holly, let's start with you.
So the fitness sector is kind of an interesting one to think about, because you think about, safety measures at all retailers and how that kind of trickled over into fitness and encouraged people to come back into it. And, there was some initial hesitation, trepidation during, key parts of the pandemic before vaccines, even after some of the vaccine rollouts, when you start to see the, rise in cases tick back up. But fitness centers were one of the areas where you want to see, people implementing safety measures or drawing on, things learned from, retail and department stores, how they implemented masks or wipes or those kinds of things. So sanitizing becomes a really important element of helping, fitness centers get back to normal. So I think as you're looking across sectors and noticing like the strategies that they're using to safety, to communicate with their, with their customers, you can learn a lot about how people are responding to those, what's working, what's not working, and then, apply as needed.
That's so interesting. Heather, same question for you.
So I would add to that, as you look across the different sectors, especially the places you don't play in, it creates this broader picture of what's going on in the customer's life. So one of the trends that we're expecting to see start to shift shopping behaviors very soon is returning to the workplace. There's a lot of people that had the benefit of working from home during the pandemic. And as they go back to work, we're going to see changes in where and when and what they shop for, but also you have dining visits here in the middle. So a lot of people that worked in an office maybe went out to eat during lunch. And if you're at home and your refrigerator is 10 feet away, you're probably not going to make that trip out to the dining establishment, whether it's to sit and eat or just grab it and go. So we are in the midst of a big shakeup that's going to change the way shoppers are living their lives. And with that, every store they stop at along the way because they're in a different mindset, in a different context.
Yes, I mean, very. I love that point so much. It kind of, I know it's like a silly example, but it almost reminds me of like, I think like Oreo during the Super Bowl when it was like, I think it was the Ravens were playing the 49ers in New Orleans and they had the kind of the blackout and Oreo had this moment of something fun to do in the dark with a picture of the cookie. And you're like, if you understand what's happening, you're going to find where you fit in as a brand or a product within that setting. And I mean, it's interesting. I think there's, we talk about this a lot on the real estate side of, live, work, play as a mentality that's changing the way we think of space. But it's, in theory, that starts on the fact that live, work, play is our lives. It's what we do. We go to work, we go to school, we do the things we need to do. And if you understand the shifts in any one part of that kind of daily journey that we have, it's going to give you so many insights into how to better be there for your audience or where you might fit in a way to kind of satisfy a need for that audience. I think it's a really fascinating perspective. And it's it's one of the ones that in our kind of always made me excited to get to have this conversation with you guys, because it was always so this really wide view of things. And it's, and it's amazing. It's always, for me, I find it very inspiring and interesting. An area that I think is kind of fascinating. Another one where I'm going to go to you both with the same question. And Heather, this time I'll start with you. It's kind of innovation within the CPG space. And the data we have up on is actually true trade areas for the M&M store in Orlando. And this is one of my favorite things. We've had conversations with kind of in the joy of the job. You get to kind of talk to a lot of folks in the CPG world. Is we'll show this and we'll show like, look, is this store's value just the M&Ms that they sell, or is it all the people that walk through and come home with this experience and interaction? And I think it's like, we were talking to another player in the food space, not obviously you guys, but it was, and they were like, ooh, that's fascinating. What might that version be like for us? And you think about the innovative thinking going on in the world of CPG. So, I mean, I'll go to both of you the same question again. Heather, let's start with you. What is the most important innovation you'd like to see take place in retail to help drive CPG success?
Well, I love the trend you were speaking about brands figuring out how they fit into more of a lifestyle as opposed to fulfilling the literal job that the product does. But for me, one of the places that I'm really looking forward to seeing how retail adapts to is media consumption has become so fragmented. We're not watching TV and reading the Sunday newspaper anymore. Even if we're watching TV, there's so many channels that we stream from, so many different ways we consume our media, and not even as a shared collective experience anymore. It's become so individualized. So if you think about it from the perspective of both CPG and the retailer, what I'm looking at is innovation in the ways that we talk to our customers. How are we going to break through to them, and where is it going to matter most?
I mean, I love that answer, but I also, I mean, when you think about, you kind of mentioned this right at the beginning, it's almost like a slight like kind of like thing, but like fitting within the lifestyle. I mean, how do you see that from like innovation perspective? How can we get closer to that point?
Of course, talking to your customers seems to be the obvious answers, and trying to peel that layer of the onion and figure out what is near and dear to their hearts. So you mentioned with M&Ms, it's not necessarily a product; it's an experience. I drive a Subaru, and because I drive a Subaru, I feel like I fit the Subaru mold of being an outdoorsy person, having a dog, spending my weekends in an outdoor setting. And it's not just a car for me, it's a lifestyle. And I see more and more of that happening in the CPG space.
That's a great example. I mean, that's why I won't get a Subaru, because I don't want anyone ever to ask me to go on a hike with them. And so I avoid it by that way. Holly, I want to ask you the same question, the biggest innovation you'd like to see take place in retail to help drive CPG success.
On the other side, where the products sit, are modulars. You have to kind of think about how the pandemic has accelerated, e-com for us. So for the longest time, e-commerce was left or not given kind of the proper attention in the planning process for your assortment. And now it's an integral part of what we're doing. So if you think about the ways that modulars have to transcend and become omni-channel fulfillment oriented, you have shoppers in stores now that need that quick, easy shop experience, but you also have to provide that fast, easy, picking experience for the associates and store staff that are going in to grab the products so that they can fulfill your online order. So, retailers, from a sense, are going to have to focus on ways to meet more of that online demand with less people behind it, so that your store workers can focus on the things that allow fulfillment to be quicker. So I think that's the area that I would want to see take off, accelerate really quickly. And Walmart in a lot of ways is, we keep seeing that in the news, but it's probably the key area that's going to change the way that we experience our product fulfillment, our goods fulfillment, and our average grocery trip, just a stock up trip that can be completely reinvented in a couple of years. It's really exciting.
Oh, that's such an interesting point. And by the way, everyone, just a reminder, because I just got a question in via email. You can use the Q&A at the top or at the bottom and just throw in the questions there. And we'll try to get to as many as possible. But this question did come in is kind of based off of what you were just saying. Like, where do you see the balance shifting between discovery versus fulfillment for the store? So kind of one of these ideas of kind of what we're going to the store to, so like to find the products, and one is to actually just get them. Do you think that balance is shifting, and how do you adapt?
That's an interesting question, because you're seeing a lot of stores approach it differently. For me, thinking about the way that Walmart's kind of using their stores to their advantage. Like we know, I read recently there are over 4,700 Walmart stores within 10 miles of 90% of the population. So that's a very distinct competitive advantage against Amazon. And they're really savvy with the way that they know their assets, their stores, the footprint that they have. So the stores almost become more experiential, possibly, in a sense where you can have embracing new areas, embracing new products, new interactive experiences, and then you speed up your I think Walmart was referring it to as the last mile, their fulfillment facilities, and automating that so that they can extend their supply chain. So really you're going at it from both angles, but your stores have to kind of transcend as well and become potentially more experiential, in my opinion.
It's a great point. I mean, I'll get to one more question before we kind of move on. So Bruno asked, I understand that the actual data shows a big shift on consumer behavior, but as the pandemic moves to a stability mode, it seems that the population will look more and more for human contact, the live, real experience, which seems to be the key for the future. Any thoughts on this? Heather, maybe we'll start with you here.
Yeah, so I think it's going to depend on the category and the context. So as an example, my husband's in the market for cell phones right now. And for him, he's one of those, he likes to do all his research on his own, read through all the customer reviews, and make his own opinion. For me, I prefer the human touch. I'd rather hear from a person directly. What are the latest features? What are they excited about? And I view them as the expert in the space. So I have a lot more trust in that one-to-one in this particular category. We go to a different category, it would be a different story. So I think it's a matter of looking at the space that you're in and the customer you want to target, because it's going to be a different answer depending on the space and the target that you have.
Yeah, you're right. And you want to be there for both. So you need to have an in-store experience that can handle the person who's nervous about the purchase and wants someone to hold their hand. And you need to have something quick so they can get the information they need. And, for the person who wants to just do it all themselves, I mean, and this kind of leads really nicely into this kind of next question. And, Holly, let's start with you here. I mean, how do you see the interaction between online and offline channels, and kind of from an approach perspective, how do you look to maximize that mix?
It's a balance for sure. And, when you're thinking about, the ways that the pandemic accelerated e-com adoption, we saw 2 years worth of digital transformation in the first 2 months of the pandemic, according to McKinsey. So e-commerce, the landscape of e-commerce has changed. You're no longer looking at just a market where younger, shoppers are primarily the audience. You're seeing all age groups that have adopted and moved toward, e-com shopping. So, for retailers that have both the physical and digital presence, your shoppers are going to be loyal and the most likely to shop both platforms and seamlessly experience all your methods of delivery, your app, your website, all of it. So it's really, key if you're going to grow loyalty among your shopper base and satisfy the customer.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Heather, for you, to what extent do you think online performance in a given area impacts your approach to offline activities and vice versa? Like, how do you see the balance there? Hey, we see something surging. Does it change the way we view offline? Do we see some surging offline? Does it change the way we view online?
I think we're starting to get to the point where we almost can't view them as separate activities, online versus offline. It's a total e-commerce experience. And for me, of course, it's been accelerated during the pandemic. We hear about older shoppers becoming more involved with e-commerce. I have my retired parents telling me they're doing mobile orders through Starbucks and now other quick serve restaurants. So it's something that's no longer a trend that's popping up with specific demographics in specific markets. It's something that needs to be accepted as a global change and something that's going to impact every corner of the retail space.
I mean, I agree with you completely. We've talked about this in a lot of other contexts, but it is very clear that you can no longer. I mean, look, Holly, you said this. You talked about this earlier. Like, you have to view these things as part of a single whole, so that you can have the most amount of success. I want to get to a couple of questions that have come in. One came in. So have we looked at the data to it and how the data adapts to click and collect models? And I think this is actually super interesting, kind of considering what we were just talking about now. What we're seeing in terms of click and collect is, one, we are working on a kind of a way of separating it out. It's not as simple right now. And so I don't have like a perfect click and collect solution. What we've seen with most of our retailers is that the trends tend to work together. So one, most of the click and collect visits they're not 30 seconds. They're taking a little bit longer. And so it's getting counted as the visit. How do you separate them out? Is there a certain place that they're always happening? Super, super interesting question that we're grappling with. So I know it's a kind of a weird half answer, but that's where we're at from a placer perspective. I wonder if, does it deepen that perspective? Heather, you're just talking about this now, like click and collect, this kind of utilization of the store and online in a really harmonious way. How do you see that evolving?
So one of the surprising data points that I've heard is how many people go to do a curbside pickup and then still end up going into the store for an item they forgot to put in their basket. So I think one of the next evolutions will be really making that feel like a seamless experience. You've got an associate loading groceries into the back of your car, and now you need to make an extra trip. That feels like a pain point that can be resolved easier. So I would say continuing to make that feel like one single shopping trip, as opposed to, oh no, I forgot something and now I need to adopt a different behavior.
Heather, we did not discuss this before, but I was asked yesterday for the thing that excites me most. And I called it BOPUS 2.0, and it was exactly what you said. So we are on the same wavelength today. This is, isn't that like the dream scenario of like figuring out how to make click and collect, but also the upsell element of the store work together? I don't know. I think you're going to start seeing people develop stores in that way, where there's like almost like, that you go to check out and you're like, I guess I'll get gum and the water and, this stupid magazine that I'm going to read later. Like, I think that type of experience is going to start happening in that BOPUS environment, or the ability to like have a payment that's not finalized and I only confirm it once I pick it up because then I can do the upsell. I agree with you. I think there's going to be huge innovation there, and I'm really excited about it. And with that, I want to thank Heather and Holly. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your insights. It is always a pleasure getting to talk to you. I think the kind of perspectives you bring, for me, the biggest one, and I talk about this a lot, is how widely you view all of retail is always super interesting to me. And I really appreciate you both joining today and sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having us.
And everyone, thank you so much for being here today. We are going to be having our next webinar in just 2 weeks, and we're going to be focusing on malls. And we're going to be asking a lot of the questions that Holly kind of touched on. How are they doing? Are they going to hopefully do better? What are the big trends we should be looking out for them? So thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.